Hello, welcome to the book room or the seance room, whatever you want to call it. I'm Michael Kelly, and there was a time 2 or 3 years ago when I would regularly each week read a story, and it's a good practice to get back into. And I want to start with some of my own. I am a writer, of course, so it's quite natural I do have some stories under my belt. And one I've been posting about on social media this last week comes from this book, For Fear of Little Men, which I wrote back in 2011. And the purpose of the book was to retell some of the classic Celtic folk stories in a manner that would be engaging for a modern reader. Now, these old stories have such deep roots, so the stories remain the same, but the way we use language, the way that we engage emotions changes as generations pass. You're accessing the same things, but in different ways. People express differently. And the idea was to make the stories easily readable and relatable to people today. So I thought, well, I may as well read the Buggane. So that's what I'm going to do now, and I hope you enjoy it. I'm not giving too much away after all, because there's quite a number of stories in this book, and I'm only reading one. So this is the Buggane. Greeba had long been a haunted and forbidding place, a bald and stern hill that shadowed the surrounding countryside. The fears and forebodings of the local people that lingered upon those slopes, oppressed by its menacing mass. And as is the way with such things, in places where the walls between worlds are thin, those negative emotions attracted the attention of a malevolent spirit, who chose Greeba Mountain to be his abode, passing from the world of phantoms into the world of manifest horrors. So the terror assumed a shape. Though what shape it was, people couldn't rightly tell. There was a shadow that moved upon the mountainside. Swift movements caught out of the corner of the eye, a dreadful shape moving in the dimness of the night. Pale eyes gleaming with a chill light. Long, clutching fingers caught at travellers, snagging their coats. And soon the fear-haunted mountain was empty and abandoned, left to the sole devices of the Buggane who now dwelt there. Years passed, and the slopes remained ungrazed, the fields remained untilled beneath the shadow of the crag. But with the passing of days came the servants of a new god, who neither feared nor respected the tales of the Buggane. This is good land, they murmured among themselves. It's a place of note, and the islanders have long fearfully worshipped the pagan demon who they claim lives there. We can usurp that worship to our own ends if we build a chapel upon that hillside. It will seize the imaginations of those who are already wont to see that side as set apart. It will establish our presence in a prime position on a perfect piece of land, and it will assert the dominance of our Lord over their pagan superstitions. And If a devil does indeed reside there? Asked one cleric, more nervous than the rest. Have you ever seen a devil? Shrugged the priest's leader. I have not. I doubt that any such thing exists. It is a superstition in the minds of the unlearned. Yet if such a creature does exist, surely the power of the Lord will prevail against it. If we are to consecrate a chapel in such a place, it must necessarily be dedicated to a strong saint, suggested the more cautious fellow. I've given thought to this, said their leader, stroking his chin. His breath was foul with fasting, yet his fingers were heavy with gold. What better to name our chapel than after St. Trinian, whose missionary work among the Scots was so lauded? He's one well used to converting the unruly Celts. The Church of St. Trinian it shall be then, conceded his fellow. For Trinian was the name by which the Manx called St. Ninian. So the priests cajoled and bullied the local people into setting foot upon those dreaded slopes, carrying stones and mortar, and the chapel began to take shape. It was a large building by the standards of that day, capable of holding a congregation of more than 20 people with a squeeze, for the priests were keen to display their audacity. The days passed, and stones were placed and cemented upon stones. The floor was flagged, and the altar stone was placed, and the people began to believe that the priests spoke truly. The Buggane, if it had ever existed at all, could not stand against the new god from the east. Finally, the roof of St. Trinian's church was in place, and the chapel stood complete, visible for miles around from its position on the hillside. This is a most gratifying day, declared the leading cleric to his fellows, his fat fingers resting upon his fat stomach. Tomorrow we shall hold a mass and consecrate the chapel. We shall attract a good congregation, and the tale of our victory over the forces of evil will spread, increasing our prestige and influence upon this island. Feeling well satisfied, and radiating that pride which had been the downfall of that devil who they invoked as a whipping boy, they returned to their humble lodgings, ate a mighty repast, and slept soundly whilst dreaming of their morning glory. Even the storm that raged later that night could not awaken them from their slumbers. The local people heard the storm, though, and shook with dread in their beds, huddled in their homes. The wind screamed in fury, pummeling trees until their branches snapped and fell. Rain lashed the earth, turning soil to mud, to pools. The blackness of the storm put the blackness of the night to shame. And there were those who swore they heard bellows of rage, even over the howling of the wind and the pounding of the downpour. In the morning, when the people gathered to witness a consecration of the new St. Trinian's church, the hillside was littered with debris, stones and slates. The roof of the chapel had been torn violently off and strewn across the surrounding area, hurled in a berserk fury. Such a terrible storm, tutted the priests, dismayed as they shook their tonsured heads and pressed their hands together in prayer. But the people knew better. They cowered back from the sight. lifting their eyes fearfully to the overshadowing crag of Greba that glared balefully down upon the shattered chapel. "This was no storm," they murmured. "That was the Buggane. He doesn't like trespassers near his lair, and he certainly doesn't like the idea of this new god setting himself up so close by." "There is no Buggane," retorted the priest in charge angrily. "There's only your foolish superstition. This storm was an act of God, who struck the roof off the chapel because of the paucity of the faith of those who built it. He has punished you for your belief in this devil, and requires that you rebuild a church to his worship, but this time with full faith and piety in your hearts." The priest, who would later become a bishop, was a large and thick-set man, with a loud voice and a quantity of gold to his name that would have astonished and then aroused suspicion among his superiors in Ireland. But the people here were farmers, who were used to seeing kings and chieftains with large frames and much wealth, so they responded in the manner in which they'd been taught, with obedience. The work resumed, and the chapel of St. Trinian once again took shape upon the slopes of Greba. But the malevolence that beat down from the craggy summit was now unmistakable, an angry watchfulness that dared these puny men to complete their task at their peril. The workers toiled with downcast faces and slumped shoulders, their eyes always averted from the threatening mass that loomed over them. But at length the work was done, and the last square of slate was nailed firmly onto the roof. The priests were satisfied and declared to the people that the chapel would be consecrated the following morning, rewarding them for their increase of faith and signifying the victory of God over the powers of darkness and superstition. The people were not at all convinced of this, and they hurried away, glancing nervously back over their shoulders. They muttered among themselves, and when they reached their homes they barred themselves inside and resolved not to show themselves until morning came and dreaded night was past. The priests noticed none of their congregation's fear. They were busy exulting as they looked at the cloudless sky without the slightest breath of wind. "This is most excellent," exclaimed the head priest. "Praise be to God! We shall have established ourselves firmly in this place by tomorrow, my brethren. Observe the weather. The Lord has smiled upon our labours. There shall be no storm tonight." So they returned to their lodgings, where they ate and were unduly merry in recognition of their triumph. Did the Lord indeed smile upon their labours? Who can tell? For the priests had done precious little work. The chapel had been constructed by the hands of the common folk. Yet there was no storm that night, so much was true. The hours of darkness passed, and the dawn came bright and clear. In their ones and twos, the people of Greba began to make their way toward the chapel of St. Trinian, and the priest smiled to see them go, and followed behind them, clad in their finest robes. The turf was torn and overturned around the chapel, rubble strewn across the hillside. Once again the roof of the church had been torn off, regardless of nails and mortar. Broken, its slates had been hurled far and wide, and St. Trinian's altar was exposed to the sky. Silently, and this time without the histrionics and fury of a storm, the Buggane had again descended to wreak his wrath upon the followers of this foolish new god. Or this was the take whispered by the common folk, to the considerable anger of the priests. But the mood was now set so against them that they dared not speak out or chastise the people for their unbelief, for it was evident that their entire mission here hung upon a thread. Without a word, their leader, his face purple with rage, turned on his heel and walked away, his assistants hurrying to keep pace with him. It would have gone hard with the priests if a stranger had not chosen that time to pass into the region, a wandering tailor named Timothy, who made his way from village to farming community, eking out a bare existence, making and repairing clothes. New outfits were an unnecessary extravagance in the eyes of most of the hard-working farming folk, and they tended to do their own repairs, so times were hard for an itinerant tailor. Recognizing this, the leader of the churchmen sent for him, and a clandestine meeting was arranged. Furtive words were exchanged, and a fat fee was promised. The following evening, Timothy sat in the small village inn, puffing on his pipe, feet disrespectfully resting on the table before him. His eyes flickered back and forth until he judged that most of the working folk of the village had now gathered for socializing. He cleared his throat noisily and began to speak. "You know," he said lightly, "I can't help but consider it curious how you folks are all gathered here in comfort when there's work to be done. It seems a crying shame to me." All eyes were turned upon the wiry little man, few of them kindly. After sizing him up, one of the men said, "Perhaps it's a shame that you can't mind your own business. There are no folks work harder than the people round here, and we'd thank you not to be saying otherwise." "Oh, do pardon me," said Timothy smoothly, "but I wasn't referring to the care of your crops, nor to the maintenance of your homes. You've certainly done yourselves proud there. No, you see, I was meaning the handsome church up the hill there, without a roof upon it. That's what seems a shame to me." The villagers looked at each other, and the men blew out their cheeks in mingled merriment and dismissal. "Ah, but you wouldn't know," said their spokesman, waving his big hand, as if to shoo the question away. "There's nobody who'll go near that accursed chapel. It's the Buggane, you see, who lives on Greba Mount. He's the one who tears the roof off. He won't share his domain with any new god from foreign parts. So we keep well away now, so we don't want to provoke him till he starts tearing heads off as well as roofs." "A Buggane?" mocked Timothy, raising his eyebrows. The locals lowered theirs in return and glowered at him from under them. "Oh man, there's no such thing as Bugganes. In this modern age we know there's only one God, and he's not some phantom who rips the roofs off churches. What does he do for an encore? Blow soot down the chimney? You've got to be having me on." The villager who had first spoken clenched his fists and jaw and said quietly and dangerously, "You should watch your mouth, stranger. You don't know what you're talking about. You'd be singing a different tune if you'd seen the devastation caused by that demon. It's easy to disbelieve when you're just passing through with a cosy inn roof over your head. It's quite a different matter when you have to eke a living within sight of that damned crag." The little tailor shook his head and chuckled. "Afraid of spooks, is it? There's no wonder I'm getting no business here when you're all scared of your own shadows. Now steady, big fella. There's no need to go raising your fists. Not against a little man like me. Besides, we can settle this whole thing perfectly amicably. What say we agree a little wager?" "What kind of a wager?" asked the village's spokesman, after exchanging suspicious glances with his fellows. "Look, I'm a tailor," said Timothy, "and you folks just haven't been buying lately. It's hard to have money to spend when there's a Buggane sitting on the best grazing land, said the man gloomily. Ah, but if I could prove to you that the Buggane doesn't exist, prompted Timothy, wouldn't that be worth a bob or two? He could see that he had their attention, so he opened his bag to show them the contents. Look here, I've cloth, scissors, a needle and thread. I need to make a pair of trousers from these. So here's what I propose in order to make all our lives easier. You fellows go and put the roof back on that chapel for the priests. Then on the night that is completed, before its consecration, I'll go in there with my bag, and to prove the mountain isn't haunted by any Buggane, I won't come out until I've finished making the trousers. Now, does that sound fair to you? Then you'll know that it's safe to graze your animals there, and you can reward me for my efforts and perhaps buy a garment or two. The local people, long accustomed to the dread of the mountain, were certainly not convinced by Timothy's bravado. But at length they began to speak among themselves, reasoning, if this fool of a tailor perishes or is forced to flee for his life from the wrath of the Buggane, then we might finally be allowed to go about our business in peace without these priests continually hounding us. So they told Timothy that he had a wager. They would rebuild the roof of St. Trinian's church, but this would be the very last time, for they feared that if the Buggane was provoked too far, he might descend from his lair and devour them all. Secretly they hoped that the sacrifice of the impudent tailor might soothe the temper of the demon. The work proceeded quickly, and the priest was smug that their little deal with Timothy had worked so well. It had cost them a little pouch of gold coins, but they were rich enough, and they congratulated themselves that the farmers and villagers were really putting their backs into the work, rebuilding the roof in record time. Truth to tell, the local people wanted the whole sorry episode to be over and done with and laid to rest as quickly as possible. Just a couple of days later, the little chapel stood snugly on the hillside, its new roof slate bright and shiny in the rays of the sinking sun. Timothy had set a small stool in a corner of the building where he intended to sit and work. He now stood outside, his bag of materials and sewing equipment slung across his shoulder, bidding a cheeky good night to the priests and the locals. I'll see you all in the morning, he called, with a nice new pair of trousers and a roof still over my head. He gave a cheery wave and walked into the church, pulling the door closed behind him. The crowd quickly dispersed as the light faded from the sky, terrified to be anywhere near the doomed building when darkness fell. Even the priests, for all their bold talk, moved more hurriedly than usual, with the occasional nervous look back over their shoulders. Timothy the tailor, however, was not at all worried. His work as an itinerant tailor had brought him into contact with all manner of people, and he was considered well-travelled by the standards of the time. But he had never yet seen anything that he couldn't furnish a rational explanation for, and he had no expectation that he ever would. In a time of superstition, he was an avowed agnostic. So he lit a few candles to cheer the dreary place up a bit, then settled down on his stool, crossed his legs, and began carefully cutting the material to size as he set about making his trousers. He was making good progress as midnight approached, and was steadily sewing the seams together. He'd be finished very shortly, and then hoped to grab a little sleep before dawn, when he could collect on his wager, add a little more to the purse of gold that the priest had already given him. He frowned, and his needle ceased its intricate dance as a trembling seemed to judder through him. He paused for a long moment, but all now seemed still. He shook his head to clear it, deciding that he must have been working for too long in such a cramped position, and his muscles were now complaining. But no matter, he'd be finished soon. He resumed his rapid sewing. A few quiet moments passed. Then he shuddered violently again. But this time the stool scraped slightly across the floor too, which didn't bode well for Timothy's muscular cramps theory. He noticed that the temperature had suddenly become very chill and clammy, and the hairs at the back of his neck were beginning to rise. He narrowed his eyes and looked about the room, but nothing could be seen. Actually, that wasn't quite true. Nothingness could be seen. There was an area of deep shadow in the middle of the flagged floor, like a pool of ink that his eyes couldn't penetrate. It hadn't been there earlier, and the light from the candles steadfastly refused to illuminate it. Indeed, they seemed to grow perceptibly dimmer as the dark stain spread. Timothy allowed his fingers to begin moving again, his eyes flicking between the trousers and the gloomy pole that now seemed to be extending upwards from the floor towards the roof, assuming a three-dimensional substance and blotting out the view of the far wall of the chapel. He was sewing frantically now, trying to get the trousers finished, still desperate to win his bet. But any ideas of having a nice snooze after he'd finished working were now long departed. He was shaking with cold and dread, and the only sleep that seemed to beckon him was a permanent one. His fingers trembled to a stop once again as he suddenly realized that he could discern two great circles of luminescence, like phosphorescent eyes, peering from within the expanding shadow. He realized that he'd stopped working and frantically started jabbing with his needle again, wincing and yelping slightly as he fumbled it and accidentally drove it into his finger. A hollow voice seemed to moan through the chapel, like old boughs sighing in the wind. "Oh man, do you see my great eyes, afire with the flame of the underworld?" Yes, I see them," panted Timothy, stitching manically. He was unable to resist the mesmerizing tone of that voice, compelled to answer against his will. Timothy continued his work with trembling hands, his eyes riveted upon the darkness, which now swirled and roiled as a shape became increasingly manifest within it. Soon a bestial face with slavering fangs and a shaggy mane, fierce horns twisting upon its brow, grinned at him. "Oh man, do you see my great head and jaws, hungry to devour you?" "I see it," whispered Timothy. He was now on the last row of stitching. The Buggane seethed and heaved in its shadows, gaining substance and solidity as it fed upon the little tailor's fears. Soon a great arm was waving freely, razor-shipped talons at its end. "Oh man, do you see my powerful hands, eager to crush your bones and rip your flesh?" "I see them," said Timothy, quaking. His fingers fumbled with buttons as he desperately tried to sew these onto the front of the trousers. Mighty lungs breathed like leather bellows, blasting hot air around the frigid chapel. The Buggane was moving freely now, its great cloven hoofs scraping on the stone-flagged floor. "Oh man, I am here, and now I shall feast upon your soul." "I don't think so," squeaked Timothy, summoning his last reserves of courage. He jumped from his stool and brandished the completed trousers in his hand. "You see, I'm finished. I've won my wager, and now you won't see me for dust." The Buggane opened its jaws wide, and Timothy quailed before the terrifying vision, the pale gleam of its eyes shining upon claws, teeth, horns and hooves, shaggy hair and mighty sinews. For one moment he stood paralyzed by its stare, then he broke and ran. But he didn't attempt to run past the Buggane as it might have expected. Instead, he scrambled up onto the sill of the gloomy little chapel's solitary window, a tiny aperture that the spectre had overlooked as insignificant. Thanking his lucky stars for being such a little fellow, Timothy fumbled of the catch and swung the window wide open. He squeezed awkwardly through it, trousers clenched tightly in his hand. He stumbled on the ground outside, scrambled back to his feet and began running as fast as he could. A claw tore at the air where he had stood just moments before. The Buggane's arm was thrust through the window at full stretch, but the creature was too large to follow him, and the arm withdrew as he sped out of its reach. Timothy ran, his lungs heaving painfully, his heart pounding with panic, and the blood pumping loud in his temples, threatening him with the possibility of fainting. He looked back over his shoulder, and what he saw made him stumble and lose his step, falling to the earth with a thud that winded him. He'd expected to see the Buggane emerging from the chapel door, left far behind him after being unable to squeeze through the window in its manifest form. But instead he was witness to those great sinewy arms tearing loose the church roof as the demon burst up through it, overleaping the wall as slates and masonry rained down upon the pasture. Timothy huddled into a ball and winced as a great chunk of slate buried itself in the soil near his head. He opened his eyes wide in panic as the ground began to tremble beneath rapid hoofbeats. The Buggane was running towards him, mouth wide in a knife-toothed grin. The little tailor scrambled back to his feet, still clutching the trousers which might yet prove to have cost him his life. He lowered his head and ran for all he was worth, tears of frustration and terror streaming down his face. There was one slim hope in Timothy's mind. Although the chapel had not been brought into service, there was nevertheless an area of consecrated ground where the local people buried their dead. The Buggane would surely not be able to pursue him across that sacred ground. He pumped his legs furiously and vaulted the iron railings, landing in a heap among the graves. He jumped up and continued running until he finally slumped forward, his hands on his knees, straining for breath. As his heartbeat began to subside, he looked back and saw the Buggane stamping in impotent fury on the far side of the railings. Whether it was the efficacy of the priest's consecration rites that held it at bay, or the more proven and solid barrier of iron which pains all malicious spirits, Timothy would not have liked to guess. All he cared about was that it had worked and he was safe. The Buggane was not altogether beaten yet, however. Howling in rage at being thwarted, it raised its great arms and took its head in its hands. It heaved and tore in a frenzy until its own head was ripped from its shoulders. It then hurled this gory missile at Timothy, mouth open in a hideous bellow. Timothy fell backwards in his panic, and the Buggane's head passed through the space where he'd been standing and impacted with the ground a few yards further on. It exploded violently with a final howl that had the villagers further down the hill quaking in their beds. The tailor's ears were ringing, but when he recovered his senses, and hauled himself to his feet, there was no longer any sign of the Buggane or its head. When the first light of day began to lighten the grass of Greeba Mountain, the local people began to appear in their ones and twos, simultaneously eager and dreading to discover the cause of the terrible noise during the night. The priests hurried close behind them, their faces paling at what they saw. The chapel of St. Trinian's was roofless once more, and on a memorial stone, carved with Ogham characters, sat Timothy the tailor. He clutched a pair of trousers to his chest, foam dribbled from his mouth, and his crazed eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking. His hair had turned quite white. The people of Greeba cared for the tailor for the rest of his days. He pressed the trousers and the purse of priest's gold into their hands, murmuring over and over again that he'd won his wager. He sat always with his back to the mountain, cowering from its mass. After a few years, his mind broken, he died at too young an age. The priests abandoned their plans for St. Trinian's Church and departed for a less haunted parish. The ruined shell of the little chapel still stands to this day, its walls supporting only the sky above. Its roofless shape is a centuries-old statement of the wrath of the Buggane. As for the Buggane itself, it abides there still, a flitting shadow upon the haunted crag of Greeba, a menacing presence that occasionally assumes shape and form and howls its challenge into the night. A thing spawned of fear and darkness, it cannot truly perish, for men will always be afraid of their own shadows. Its hunched shape is now headless, but a new face has grown upon its misshapen chest, and it leers down upon those who still live in the shadow of its domain. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you want more, For Fear of Little Men by Michael H. Kelly, available from Amazon and Lulu. Bye for now. More soon. I enjoyed that.